The air in the provisional stay station in Ciudad Juárez was thick with the scent of unwashed bodies, stale food, and the metallic tang of despair. It was Monday, March 27, 2023. Through the high, barred windows, the Chihuahuan sun was beginning its slow descent, painting the dusty sky in shades of orange and purple that felt like a cruel joke. For Eduardo, a 23-year-old from Venezuela, that sky was a canvas of a dream just out of reach. He had walked, bussed, and begged his way across a continent, only to end up in this cage. A stone's throw from the American border he could almost taste. He sat on a thin, worn mattress, his back against the cold concrete wall, watching the dust motes dance in the fading light. Next to him, a man from Guatemala named Javier, whose face was etched with lines far too deep for his 30-odd years, was methodically tearing a small strip from the hem of his shirt. "They treat us like animals," Javier whispered, his voice raspy. He didn't look at Eduardo. His eyes were fixed on the guards patrolling the corridor outside their cell, their faces impassive, their posture exuding a bored indifference. Eduardo just nodded. He had no energy left for anger. The journey had stripped it from him, leaving only a hollow ache of exhaustion and a fragile, flickering hope. "My sister is in Denver," he said softly, more to himself than to Javier. "She sent me money for the bus from Mexico City. They took it all, the phone too." He thought of the last picture he'd seen of his niece, smiling with a missing front tooth. The memory was a sharp, physical pain. The cell, designed for no more than 20 people, held nearly 70 men. They were from Venezuela, Guatemala, Honduras, El Salvador. Strangers bound by a shared, suffocating limbo. The tension had been simmering for days, a low boil of frustration that was rapidly approaching its breaking point. Earlier, a group of men had pleaded for water, their voices cracking with dehydration. A guard had laughed, tapping his baton against the steel bars. "Behave," he'd said, "and maybe we'll think about it." That laughter was the spark. A man near the front of the cell, his face a mask of rage, began to shout. He rattled the bars, his voice raw with indignation. "Agua, queremos agua, no somos criminals." The cry was taken up by others, a chorus of desperation that echoed through the concrete halls. The guards simply watched, their expressions unchanged. The protest felt futile, a scream into the void. As the shouting intensified, some of the more desperate men began to pull the thin foam mattresses from the bunks, piling them against the locked cell door. It was a barricade born of powerlessness, a symbolic act of defiance. Eduardo watched, his heart pounding a frantic rhythm against his ribs. He felt a primal fear mix with a strange sense of solidarity. Javier stopped fiddling with his shirt and stood up, his weary eyes suddenly alight with a dangerous fire. "If they won't listen to our words," he snarled, "maybe they'll see this." Someone produced a lighter. Eduardo didn't see who it was in the crush of bodies. He just saw the small, determined flick of a thumb. A tiny orange flame, no bigger than a thumbnail, bloomed in the dim light. It touched the corner of a dry, flammable mattress. For a heartbeat, there was silence, the men watching the small flame as if hypnotized. Then, it greedily licked up the foam, and a plume of thick, acrid black smoke began to curl towards the ceiling. The air that blew through the cracked bus window was dry and carried the grit of the Chihuahuan desert. For days, Eduardo had watched the landscape change, the lush green of southern Mexico slowly giving way to this vast, ochre-colored emptiness. But now, through the haze of dust and diesel fumes, he could see it. The sprawling, chaotic grid of Ciudad Juárez, and beyond it, under the pale blue sky, the faint silhouette of mountains in El Paso, Texas. The United States. A wave of exhaustion and fragile hope washed over him. He was so close. He clutched the worn strap of his backpack, containing a tattered photo of his mother and a small, folded Venezuelan flag. He thought of Caracas, not the city of his childhood, but the hollowed-out shell it had become. He remembered the gnawing hunger, the empty shelves in the stores, the constant fear that simmered just beneath the surface of daily life. He saw his mother's face, her eyes filled with a painful mixture of pride and terror as she pressed her last few bolivars into his hand at the bus station. "Go, Mijo," she had whispered, her voice cracking. "Make a life. Don't look back." That promise had been his fuel through Colombia, through the treacherous Darien Gap, and across the length of Mexico. It was the reason he was here, staring at the border that separated his past from a potential future. Stepping off the bus into the bustling streets of Juárez was a sensory assault. The blare of car horns, the rapid-fire Spanish of street vendors, the smell of frying meat and exhaust fumes. It was overwhelming, a city teetering on a knife's edge between desperation and opportunity. He spent his last pesos on a bottle of water and a gordita, the unfamiliar taste a small comfort. He felt a flicker of optimism. This was the final step. He just needed to find the right place, the official entry point, to request asylum. He wasn't trying to do it illegally, he wanted to explain his story. He asked a man selling phone chargers for directions to the immigration office. The man pointed vaguely toward a bridge in the distance. "Be careful, chamo," the man said, recognizing his accent. "The INM guys are everywhere. They don't ask many questions." Eduardo thanked him and started walking, his heart pounding a little faster. He hadn't gone more than a few blocks when a white van with official government markings pulled up beside him. Two men in beige uniforms got out. "Instituto Nacional de Migración," one of them said, his tone flat and devoid of warmth. "Your papers." Eduardo fumbled for his Venezuelan ID, explaining that he was on his way to seek asylum. The guards exchanged a look of bored indifference. "You need to come with us. Standard procedure. We'll process you at the station." The words were routine, but the coldness in their eyes sent a chill down his spine. The promise of a few hours, a simple check, felt like a lie. Before he could protest further, he was being guided into the back of the van. The station was a stark, fortress-like building near the Stanton Lerdo Bridge. It wasn't an office. It was a cage. The smell hit him first, a sour mix of sweat, stale air, and chemical cleaners that couldn't mask the underlying human misery. He was stripped of his backpack, his shoelaces, and his belt. The photo of his mother was confiscated. No personal items. He was pushed through a final doorway into a large, cavernously grim room. Dozens of men were crammed inside, lying on thin mattresses spread across the floor. The windows were high and covered with thick bars. Men from Guatemala, Honduras, El Salvador. Their faces held the same dazed, hollowed-out look he now felt settling onto his own. The heavy metal door slammed shut behind him, the sound of the bolt sliding home echoing with a terrible finality. The fragile hope that had carried him thousands of miles evaporated, replaced by the cold, hard reality of a locked cell. He was a prisoner. The tiny flame, born from a flicker of defiance, was insatiably hungry. It licked at the synthetic cover of the thin mattress, hesitating for only a heartbeat before devouring it. A cheer went up from a few of the men, a guttural cry of frustration finally given a voice. But the cheer died in their throats as the fire didn't just burn, it erupted. It leaped from the first mattress to the second, then the third, a chain reaction of combustion fueled by cheap, flammable foam. A wave of intense, dry heat washed over the cell, stealing the breath from Eduardo's lungs. Panic, cold and sharp, replaced the simmering anger. The orange glow that had briefly illuminated their faces in a moment of rebellion now cast long, dancing shadows of terror. Black, acrid smoke billowed upwards, thick and oily, instantly hitting the ceiling and spreading outwards like a toxic canopy. The smell was horrendous, a chemical stench of melting plastic and burning foam that clawed at the back of the throat. Coughing started, first as a few scattered hacks, then as a violent, cell-wide chorus of choking. "Open the door," someone screamed, his voice cracking with fear. The cry was taken up by others. The defiant protest had become a desperate plea for life. Fists that had been raised in anger now hammered against the steel door, the rhythmic, metallic clangor a frantic drumbeat of doom. "Abran la puerta, por favor, nos quemamos." "Open the door, please, we're burning." Eduardo scrambled backwards, away from the growing inferno, his body pressed against the cold concrete wall. The smoke was descending rapidly. a suffocating blanket that stung his eyes until they streamed with tears, blurring the horrific scene into a swirl of orange and black. He could barely make out the figures of the other men, silhouettes stumbling through the thickening haze, their movements growing more frantic and less coordinated. He saw a young Guatemalan man, one he'd shared a piece of bread with earlier, collapse in a fit of coughing, his body curling into a fetal position on the floor. Through the small, barred window in the door, Eduardo could see the guards. For a moment, a sliver of hope pierced his terror. They were there, they saw, but they weren't moving. One stood with his arms crossed, his face a mask of indifference. Another just watched, his expression unreadable behind the swirling smoke on the other side of the glass. They weren't opening the door. The realization hit Eduardo with the force of a physical blow. They were being left to die. Air became a precious commodity, something to be fought for. Eduardo ripped a piece of his t-shirt and pressed it over his mouth and nose, but the smoke was too thick, its poisonous tendrils seeping through the flimsy fabric. Every gasp was a mouthful of fire and chemicals. The heat was unbearable, blistering his exposed skin. The screams around him were starting to fade, replaced by raspy groans and the terrifying sound of bodies slumping to the floor. The world narrowed to a pinprick of searing pain and the desperate, primal need for one clean breath. His vision tunneled, the edges darkening. The last thing he saw was the face of the guard, watching, as the blackness finally rushed in and claimed him. A persistent, rhythmic beeping was the first thing to pierce the void. It was a sterile, impersonal sound, a stark contrast to the cacophony of screams and desperate pounding that haunted the edges of his memory. Eduardo's eyelids felt fused together, heavy as lead shutters. He tried to take a deep breath, but a searing pain shot through his chest and throat, ending in a dry, rasping cough that felt like tearing sandpaper. Every nerve ending screamed in protest. The smell wasn't the acrid stench of burning plastic and human sweat, but a clean, sharp scent of antiseptic and rubbing alcohol. He forced his eyes open. The world was a blur of white. White ceiling, white sheets, the soft white gauze wrapped around his hands and arms. The beeping came from a machine beside his bed, its green line rising and falling in time with his tortured breaths. A clear tube ran from an IV bag into his arm, another delivered oxygen to his nostrils. He was no longer in the cell. He was somewhere else, somewhere clean and terrifyingly quiet. Panic, cold and sharp, began to creep in. He tried to sit up, but the effort sent waves of agony through his body. His skin felt tight and raw, a size too small for his frame. A soft voice cut through his haze. "Tranquilo, tranquilo, estás a salvo, you're safe now." A woman in blue scrubs came into his field of vision. She had kind eyes and a gentle smile, though it didn't quite reach them. She checked the monitor, then adjusted his pillow with practiced care. She spoke in Spanish, her accent softer than the one he was used to in Juárez. "Where?" Eduardo's voice was a hoarse whisper, each word a struggle. "Where am I?" "You're in a hospital in El Paso, Texas," she said, her voice calm and steady. "You were brought here last night. You have some serious burns and smoke inhalation, but you are stable. You're very lucky." El Paso. The name hung in the air. He had made it across the border. Not by sprinting past guards or hiding in a truck, but on a gurney hovering between life and death. The irony was a bitter pill he couldn't swallow. Flashes of the fire returned, no longer just distant echoes, but vivid, horrifying images. The orange glow through the thick black smoke, the heat melting the skin. The faces of the other men, twisted in terror. Carlos from Honduras, who spoke of his 2 daughters. Jose from Guatemala, who just wanted to work and send money home. Their faces swam before him, their screams filling the sterile silence of the room. "The fire," he croaked, the memory making his heart hammer against his ribs, a frantic rhythm that matched the beeping of the machine. "The cell, the others," he looked at the nurse, his eyes pleading. He needed to know, but he was terrified of the answer. The nurse's professional calm wavered for a moment. She placed a comforting hand on his shoulder, the light pressure a stark contrast to the violence he had just endured. "The doctors will be in to speak with you soon," she said evasively, her gaze softening with pity. "For now, you need to rest. Your body has been through a terrible ordeal." Her refusal to answer was an answer in itself. The sterile quiet of the room suddenly felt suffocating, a tomb where the ghosts of his fellow detainees waited just beyond his sight. The dream of a new life had died in that fire. And as he lay there, bandaged and broken, Eduardo began to understand that he had not escaped the cell. He had simply been moved to a different kind of prison, one built of grief, pain, and the crushing weight of being a survivor. The hours bled into one another, measured only by the changing shifts of nurses and the slow drip of the IV bag beside his bed. Eduardo existed in a fog of pain and morphine, the sterile white of the hospital room a stark canvas for the fiery images that burned behind his eyes. He saw the faces: Carlos from Guatemala, who dreamed of seeing snow; Miguel, who'd shared a stale piece of bread with him 2 days before the fire; the quiet boy from Honduras, whose name he never learned. Their faces, contorted first in defiance, then in terror, flickered in his mind, their desperate screams echoing in the profound silence. The gentle click of the door pulled him from his waking nightmare. A doctor he recognized, Dr. Evans, entered, his expression somber. He was not alone. With him was a woman in a formal suit, her face etched with a grave professionalism that made Eduardo's heart hammer against his ribs. She carried a leather portfolio, and her presence screamed of official business, of truths he wasn't sure he could bear. "Eduardo," Dr. Evans began, his voice soft. "This is Miss Thompson from the consulate. We need to talk to you about what happened. Do you feel up to it?" Eduardo could only manage a slow, stiff nod. His throat felt like it was lined with gravel. Miss Thompson stepped forward, her eyes holding a flicker of compassion that warred with her official demeanor. "Mr. Ramirez, first, I want to express my deepest condolences. What you have endured is unimaginable." She paused, taking a breath. "We have been working with the Mexican authorities to identify everyone, to account for everyone." The air grew heavy, thick with unspoken finality. Eduardo braced himself, his bandaged hands gripping the thin hospital blanket. Dr. Evans took over, his clinical tone meant to be grounding, but only serving to sharpen the horror. "Eduardo, of the 68 men being held in that section of the facility, there were 29 survivors. You were one of 28 who were critically injured and transferred here or to other specialized burn units." Eduardo's mind fumbled with the numbers, a desperate, irrational hope fighting against the cold arithmetic. 68 minus 29. Miss Thompson delivered the final blow, her voice steady but devoid of warmth. 39 men died in the fire, Eduardo. I am so terribly sorry." 39. The number didn't just land. It detonated inside him. It wasn't an abstract statistic. It was Carlos, it was Miguel, it was the quiet boy. It was a roll call of faces, of shared hopes and whispered fears in the dark. The sterile room began to spin. The beeping of the monitor beside him seemed to grow louder, a frantic, rhythmic counterpoint to the silent scream trapped in his chest. Why him? Why was he breathing this clean, cool air while they had suffocated on smoke and ash? The guilt was a physical thing, a crushing weight settling on his lungs, making each breath a betrayal. He barely registered another person entering the room until she spoke. Her name was Sarah, and her voice was different, less official, more gentle. She explained she was from a human rights organization. "We are here to help," she said, looking directly at him. "To make sure your rights are protected and to help find justice for what happened. When you are ready, only when you feel you can, we would like to hear your story. The world needs to know." Her words were a distant lifeline thrown into a sea of grief. Justice. The word felt hollow, an insult to the memory of the dead. What justice could bring them back? The officials eventually left, leaving him alone with Sarah's business card on his bedside table. He stared at his hands, wrapped in layers of white gauze. These hands had pounded on a locked door. They had tried to shield his face from the heat, but they had saved no one. He was a survivor. And in the crushing silence of the hospital room, that felt less like a miracle and more like a curse. The days that followed blurred into a monotonous cycle of pain management, wound care, and the suffocating silence of the hospital room. For Eduardo, the quiet was the worst part. It was a blank canvas onto which his mind projected the horrors of the fire. He'd stare at the acoustic ceiling tiles, and they would melt and warp into the metal bars of the cell, glowing orange in the inferno. The antiseptic smell of the room would suddenly be replaced by the acrid stench of burning foam and human desperation. Sleep offered no escape, only fragmented nightmares of smoke-filled darkness and the silenced voices of his friends. He was haunted by the woman's words, Sophia, from the human rights group. "A statement," she had said. "Justice." The words felt hollow, like stones dropped into a bottomless well. What was justice for 39 lives extinguished in a locked cage? What statement could possibly contain the magnitude of that terror? Maria, the nurse with kind eyes and gentle hands, became his only anchor to the present. She spoke to him in soft Spanish, not with pity, but with a quiet understanding that transcended words. One afternoon, while changing the dressings on his arm, she saw him flinch, his eyes wide with a terror that wasn't from the physical pain. "They're with you now, aren't they?" she asked softly, her hands never ceasing their steady work. Eduardo could only nod, his throat tight. "I hear them," he rasped, his voice raw from disuse and damage. "I see their faces. Carlos, he was telling me about his little girl. He had a picture he kept folded in his pocket." The memory was a physical blow, stealing the air from his lungs. "Remembering him is not a curse, Eduardo," Maria said, meeting his gaze. "It is a burden, yes, a heavy one, but it is also a way of honoring him. Your memory is all he has left now." Her words settled in his chest, not healing the wound, but cleansing it somehow. For days, he had been trying to push the memories away, to build a wall against the grief. Maria gave him permission to let the wall crumble. That night, a memory returned with searing clarity. It wasn't just the chaos and the smoke, it was a specific moment. He was pressed against the back wall, gasping for clean air that wasn't there. Across the cell, he saw Miguel, a quiet man from Honduras who dreamed of being a carpenter, pounding on the bars, his face contorted in a plea. And through the bars, clear as day, Eduardo saw the silhouette of a guard, standing, watching, his form motionless against the flickering orange glow. The guard did nothing. He just watched them burn. The image broke something inside Eduardo. It wasn't just negligence, it was a choice to let them die. The burning rage that washed over him was different from the fire. It was cold, sharp, and purposeful. Silence wasn't an option. Silence was what the guard had offered them. To remain silent would be the final betrayal. The next morning, when Maria came in with his breakfast, she found him sitting up, his eyes clear for the first time in days. The haunted look was gone, replaced by a grim resolve. "Maria," he said, his voice stronger. "The card that woman left, the lawyer, can you get it for me? I need you to help me call her." Maria paused, a small, knowing smile touching her lips. She walked to the small bedside table, picked up the business card, and handed it to him. "I think," she said, her voice full of warmth, "it is time for the world to hear your voice." 6 months later, the El Paso sun felt different. It wasn't the oppressive, indifferent heat that baked the dust of Juárez, but a warmth that seemed to promise something other than survival. Eduardo sat in a small, sparsely furnished apartment, a temporary home arranged by Sophia's human rights organization. His burns had healed into a permanent tapestry of scars across his arms and back, a constant, physical reminder of the fire. Yet the raw agony had subsided, replaced by a dull, persistent ache he was learning to live with. His laptop screen glowed, illuminating Sophia's face on a video call. Her expression, usually a careful mix of professional resolve and empathy, was today tinged with something more, a quiet, profound victory. "They did it, Eduardo," she said, her voice steady but carrying the weight of the news. "The Mexican Attorney General's office has formally charged 5 individuals with homicide, 2 federal agents, 1 migration agent, and the private security guard. Your testimony, it was the cornerstone. You put a face to the negligence. You gave the men a voice. Eduardo listened, his breath catching in his throat. Homicide. The word echoed in the silent room. It wasn't just an accident, a tragedy, a bureaucratic failure. It was being called what it was. He closed his eyes, and for a second the acrid smell of smoke filled his senses, the memory of desperate screams clawing at the edges of his mind. But this time, something else pushed back. Sofia's words, a voice. "The guard," Eduardo said, his voice raspy. "The one who watched, is he one of them?" "He is," Sofia confirmed softly. "He was among the first to be arrested." A single tear traced a path down Eduardo's cheek, not of sorrow, but of a heavy, gut-wrenching relief. The weight on his soul didn't vanish, but it shifted, becoming less of a crushing burden and more of something he could carry. Justice wasn't an abstract concept anymore. It was the clang of a cell door closing on the men who had locked them in to die. After the call, he walked to the corner of his room where a small, makeshift memorial stood on a wooden crate. He had 39 small, battery-operated candles, one for each man. With Sofia's help, he'd managed to get a list of the names of the dead. He read them aloud sometimes, a quiet litany of remembrance. Today, he didn't just read them, he spoke to them. "They heard us," he whispered to the silent, flickering lights. "They can't ignore you anymore. Rest now, we are being heard." Later that afternoon, he sat on a bench in a nearby park, watching children play on a brightly colored jungle gym. He took his phone out and dialed a familiar number. "Maria," he said when she answered. "Eduardo, how are you?" Maria's voice was as warm and kind as he remembered from the sterile hospital room. It was the voice that had first tethered him back to the world of the living. "I'm okay," he said, and was surprised to find he meant it. "I'm really okay. I wanted to thank you again, for everything." "You just focus on getting stronger, you hear me?" she said. "You have a new life to build." He looked up at the vast, clear Texas sky. Maria was right. The road ahead was long. The legal battles would stretch for years. His own healing was a journey without a final destination. But the fire had forged him into something new. He was no longer just a migrant running from a broken home or a victim broken by tragedy. He was a witness. He carried the memory of 39 souls, not as a haunting, but as a purpose. He took a deep, slow breath, filling his lungs with clean air, a simple, profound luxury. He had survived to tell their story, and now he would live to see justice done.